The rain hadn't stopped in days. It wasn't the kind of storm that howled and thrashed. It was a steady, soft drizzle that settled over the city like a sigh. He stood at the window, watching the droplets chase each other down the glass, mesmerized by their slow descent. Outside, the streets were quiet. The world seemed hushed, as if waiting for something to begin, or perhaps for something to finally end. And in that stillness, he felt a stirring inside him, one that had long been ignored. He didn't know when the heaviness had first settled in. Maybe it had crept in gradually, like fog rolling across a familiar landscape. Or maybe it had arrived all at once, triggered by something seemingly small, an unanswered message, a missed opportunity, a dream quietly shelved in favor of practicality. Whatever the cause, it had been there for a while, hiding beneath layers of routine, responsibility, and the stories he told himself to keep moving forward. He wasn't broken, he kept reminding himself. Just tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Tired in his bones, in his thoughts, in the way the days blurred into each other without color or texture. Life hadn't become unbearable, just muted. A grayscale version of the world he once saw in vivid hues. He had become a participant in his own life rather than the author. He woke up, he worked, he spoke when spoken to, and he smiled at the right moments. But underneath it all, there was a quiet yearning for something more honest, more alive. There was no dramatic event that had sparked his reflection. No life-altering accident or shattering betrayal. It was just a moment, ordinary and unremarkable, when he realized that he had been moving through life like a ghost, touching everything but never truly feeling anything. And in that moment of clarity, something shifted. He didn't collapse or cry. He simply turned inward, listening for the first time in a long while to the small, trembling voice that whispered beneath the noise, "You've forgotten who you are." Not in the sense of memory loss, but in the soul-deep way that happens when we stop asking ourselves what matters. He had been so busy trying to be what the world needed, what his family expected, what his past required of him, that he had silenced his own needs. Needs for wonder, for connection, for stillness. Needs that had long gone unmet in the pursuit of being dependable. He didn't resent anyone, not really. Everyone had their own battles, their own expectations. But he did feel sadness for himself and for all the moments he had traded authenticity for acceptance. The times he had laughed at jokes that hurt him, the nights he had said he was fine when he was unraveling inside, the dreams he had buried because they didn't align with the image of who he was supposed to be. He wanted to remember what it felt like to be fully alive, to wake up with excitement instead of dread, to feel something, anything, with his whole heart. He didn't want to escape his life. He wanted to inhabit it, every messy, beautiful, complicated part of it. And he knew that wouldn't come from changing the world around him, but from changing the way he met it. So he started small. He didn't quit his job or book a one-way flight to somewhere exotic. He just began to notice the way the morning light filtered through the curtains, the sound of his own breath in a quiet room, the way his heartbeat quickened when he heard a song that reminded him of who he used to be. He didn't try to fix everything at once. He just made space for awareness, for emotion, for truth. At first, it felt uncomfortable, like trying to stretch muscles that had long been unused. He had been numb for so long that feeling again, even joy, was unfamiliar. But he stayed with it. When sadness rose, he let it. When memories surfaced, he welcomed them. He stopped pushing things away and started pulling them closer, not to dwell, but to understand. He realized how much of his pain had come from pretending to be strong when he was scared, pretending to be indifferent when he cared deeply, pretending to be content when he was silently longing for more. And every time he had pretended, he had moved a little further away from himself. Now he was choosing the opposite, to be real, even if that meant being vulnerable, even if it meant being misunderstood. The people around him noticed the change. Some admired it, others questioned it. "Are you okay?" they would ask, confused by his new stillness, his refusal to engage in drama, his quiet boundaries. He would smile and say, "I'm learning to be." And that was the truth. He wasn't seeking happiness in the traditional sense. He was seeking alignment, a life that didn't require constant performance, a life where he could simply be. He began journaling again, not to track achievements, but to explore his inner world. He wrote about his fears, his desires, his regrets, and his hopes. The words didn't always come easily, but they came honestly. And in them, he found pieces of himself he thought he'd lost. The dreamer, the poet, the child who used to wonder about the stars. These parts of him hadn't vanished. They had just been waiting patiently for him to return. He took walks in silence, letting nature recalibrate his spirit. He watched birds without envy, trees without judgment, rivers without resistance. He saw in them a wisdom that he had forgotten. They didn't try to be anything other than what they were. They moved with the seasons, adapted to the changes, and trusted in their place in the grand design. He wanted that kind of ease, not the absence of struggle, but the absence of unnecessary struggle, the kind that comes from fighting against your own nature. He stopped asking what he was supposed to do with his life and started asking what his life was trying to teach him. The answers didn't come in loud declarations, but in subtle nudges. He felt drawn to music again, to poetry, to conversations that lingered in the heart long after the words were spoken. He wasn't becoming someone new. He was returning to someone old, someone true. And in that return, he found a kind of peace that he hadn't known before. Not the fleeting kind that depends on circumstances, but the steady kind that grows when you're in integrity with yourself. He didn't need all the answers. He just needed to be honest about the questions. And the question that mattered most now was this: how do I live a life that feels like mine? It was a question that didn't demand a quick answer. It asked for presence, for listening, for the courage to let go of what no longer served and the patience to wait for what would. He didn't have it all figured out, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir deep inside him. A quiet yes. Yes to starting again. Yes to feeling more and fearing less. Yes to being seen, not for what he accomplished, but for who he was when no one was watching. Yes to the journey back to wholeness. And in that yes, a new chapter began, not in grand declarations or dramatic shifts, but in the small, steady steps of someone who had finally remembered that life isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. He found himself walking through places he had once rushed past without noticing. Familiar streets now looked unfamiliar, not because they had changed, but because he had. The brick walls bore stories, the leaves on the trees carried whispers, and even the cracks on the pavement seemed to trace out something ancient and honest. It was as if the world had always been speaking to him in quiet tones, and only now had he learned how to listen. There was a small bench at the end of a park trail, tucked away beneath the outstretched arms of an old oak tree. He had passed it countless times before, but had never once sat on it. That day he did, not because he was tired, but because he was finally willing to be still. As he sat, he watched an elderly couple shuffle slowly along the path, their hands loosely clasped as if the years had carved their fingers to fit perfectly together. Their pace was unhurried, their silence comfortable. It wasn't about the destination, it was about the walk itself. He closed his eyes and let the breeze graze his skin, let the sound of distant laughter settle into his chest, let the hum of the world remind him that life hadn't stopped just because he had slowed down. And in that stillness, something became clear. He had spent so much of his life chasing purpose, yet the moments that filled him most were the ones where he simply paused and existed without demand. He remembered the boy he used to be, the one who once stared out the window during long car rides, imagining entire universes hidden behind the hills, the one who found magic in puddles, adventure in shadows, and questions in everything. That boy hadn't cared about productivity. He cared about presence. He hadn't been weighed down by identity or status. He had just been curious about the world, about others, about himself. Where had that boy gone? Maybe he hadn't gone anywhere. Maybe he'd just been waiting for the adult version of himself to stop pretending he had it all figured out, waiting for the man to soften, to stop measuring worth by what he could prove, waiting for him to look inward with something more tender than judgment. And now, as he sat on that park bench beneath a hush of trees, he realized they could finally meet again. It felt like a reunion, not a loud, dramatic one, but a quiet acknowledgement between two souls who had always belonged to each other. He didn't need to mourn the time lost. He only needed to honor the return. He began to approach his days differently, not with plans to conquer them, but with the desire to move through them with reverence. He noticed how his coffee tasted richer when he drank it slowly, how music stirred something ancient, how eye contact, real eye contact, could melt years of distance in a moment. He started to look at people more deeply, not just at their expressions, but at what they carried beneath them. The man in the grocery store line, nervously fumbling through his coupons. The child on the bus staring out the window with wonder in her eyes. The woman at the cafe who sat alone with a book, but whose gaze drifted often, as if she were searching for something the words couldn't give her. He no longer saw strangers. He saw stories, and in those stories, reflections of his own. It made him softer, more patient, more open. Not because life had suddenly become easier, but because he had stopped resisting its texture. He embraced the cracks, the inconsistencies, the moments of discomfort. He learned to sit with uncertainty, to befriend confusion, to treat even fear with compassion. These were no longer enemies to be conquered, but messengers to be heard. There were days he still felt lost, but even on those days, he no longer felt alone. He had discovered something sacred, a companionship with himself, a quiet understanding that no matter how dark it got, he would not abandon himself again. That alone gave him strength. Not the loud, brash kind, but the quiet, enduring strength of someone who has walked through fire and learned to carry warmth instead of ashes. He began to speak more gently, not just to others, but to himself. The voice in his head, once harsh and demanding, now sounded more like an old friend, one who offered grace, who allowed space for imperfection, who reminded him that stumbling wasn't failure, it was movement. He no longer needed to be flawless. He only needed to be present. He laughed more, cried more, felt more. Life, once numb, now pulsed with emotion, and he let it. He let joy flood his chest when it arrived. He let grief shake his shoulders when it needed to. He let awe steal his breath when he stood beneath a sky full of stars. These were not distractions from living. They were the very fabric of it. And in allowing himself to feel fully, he found himself reconnecting with others in ways that once seemed impossible. Conversations became deeper, more vulnerable. He asked questions not to respond, but to understand. He shared stories not to impress, but to connect. He didn't need to be the smartest or the strongest in the room. He only needed to be real. He had learned that connection wasn't about always agreeing. It was about always listening, always showing up with the intention to understand. And in a world so quick to divide, that kind of presence was revolutionary. He no longer looked for validation in applause or acknowledgement. His worth wasn't something others could give him. It lived within him, in how he moved through his days, in how he treated others when no one was watching, in how he held his own heart with gentleness. Sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, he would reflect on his day, not to judge or critique, but to witness, to ask himself, did I live today with honesty? Did I offer kindness where I could? Did I remember to be human? And even on the days when the answer was no, he didn't spiral into shame. He simply breathed, forgave, and promised to try again tomorrow. Because that was the journey, not toward perfection, but toward presence. Not toward being right, but toward being whole. And wholeness, he had learned, wasn't about fixing every crack. It was about seeing beauty in the cracks, letting the light in through them, letting them remind him that he had lived, that he had endured, that he had become. He no longer needed to be someone else to be enough. He didn't need to arrive somewhere to begin. He was already on the path, already becoming, already enough. There was a quiet afternoon when he found himself sitting at the edge of a field, surrounded by nothing but the distant hum of nature. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and old earth, and it reminded him of something he couldn't quite name, something warm and fleeting, like a childhood memory that visits in dreams. He picked up a small stone beside him, turning it over in his hand, and wondered how long it had been there, how much it had seen, how effortlessly it had existed without needing to prove its worth. That thought stayed with him longer than he expected. The idea that value didn't need to be performed, that perhaps simply being, enduring, witnessing, being part of something greater was enough. The stone didn't apologize for its silence. The tree beside him didn't beg for attention. The sky didn't seek approval for its color. They all simply were, and they belonged. He wanted to belong in that way, not because he had earned it, but because he too was a part of this great unfolding. He had spent so many years tying his worth to doing, accomplishing, succeeding, being good. But in this still moment, surrounded by the humility of nature, he began to believe that perhaps his presence alone was a miracle. He lay back on the grass and stared up at the sky, letting the clouds drift across his vision like thoughts he didn't need to hold on to. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of breath, and for a moment, everything felt soft, forgivable, true. He started practicing gratitude, not in the rehearsed way he once had, but in the raw, spontaneous way that rises when your heart opens unexpectedly. A cup of warm soup on a cold day. The way a dog looked up at its owner with complete trust. The deep exhale that came when he finally allowed himself to feel tired without guilt. These things, once small, had become sacred. And with each act of noticing, a door opened. A door back into his body, his spirit, his truth. He realized how long he had lived outside himself, hovering in the expectations of others, stretching to meet versions of himself he didn't even recognize. He had betrayed his own intuition again and again, just to keep the peace. But there was no peace in pretending, only delay, only distance from what truly mattered. So he returned, slowly, gently, unevenly. Some mornings he woke up with clarity, others with fog. But either way, he met himself where he was, no longer demanding a particular version of himself to show up. Just grateful to still be here, still learning, still becoming. He began to speak his truth more openly, not forcefully, but clearly. When something didn't feel right, he named it. When his heart pulled him in a new direction, he listened, even if no one else understood, even if it made him uncomfortable, because he had spent too many years prioritizing comfort over growth. And now he was choosing growth. That didn't mean discarding people or abandoning the past. It meant holding them with love and choosing alignment anyway. It meant thanking the old paths for their lessons, then stepping onto new ones with reverence. He also started listening more, not just to words, but to tone, to energy, to what was being said beneath what was being spoken. People carried so much within them, and he no longer needed to fix or rescue. He only needed to be present. Sometimes the greatest gift he could give was space. Space for others to be seen, to unravel, to exist without performance. His relationships shifted because of this. Some deepened, others faded, a few ended. But there was no drama in that loss, only honesty. He had learned that not all goodbyes were failures. Some were acts of love, some were acknowledgments that a chapter had ended, and that was okay. He began valuing quality over quantity, one deep conversation over 10 shallow ones, one moment of true presence over a week of pretending, one friend who saw him fully over a room full of acquaintances who only knew fragments. There was a day when he stood at a lake's edge, skipping stones, and thought about how often he had tried to skip over his own emotions, to glide quickly past them so he wouldn't feel the sting. But now he let them sink, watched them ripple through his being, and then watched the stillness return. That stillness became his sanctuary, not a place without noise, but a place where the noise no longer dictated the tempo of his soul, where he could hear the gentle hum beneath everything, the voice that said, "Keep going, you're doing fine." He no longer feared solitude, he welcomed it. It wasn't loneliness, it was clarity, a space where he could realign, recharge, and remember who he was beneath the noise. And in that remembering, he also started to dream again, not with urgency, but with wonder. What would it look like to live gently, to create without needing applause, to love without needing permission, to walk through the world not seeking to conquer it, but to walk beside it, learn from it, honor it? The dreams were quieter than they used to be. Less about achievement and more about essence. Less about climbing and more about rooting. They weren't fantasies, they were invitations, and he accepted them, one breath at a time. He discovered that his joy didn't look like other people's. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was the joy of walking barefoot in wet grass, of hearing the creak of an old door he once found annoying, of drinking tea in silence and feeling every sip. These small joys accumulated into something vast, a life that no longer needed to be extraordinary because it was deeply, unmistakably his. He stopped waiting for a perfect moment to start living. He stopped waiting to be ready, to be healed, to be enough. He realized he would wait forever if he kept postponing peace. So he chose it now, in this breath, in this choice, in this sacred, imperfect step. And every day he repeated that choice, not always with ease, not always with clarity, but with sincerity. He didn't need to prove his worth. He only needed to honor it. And honoring it meant letting go of the stories that kept him small, the ones that said he had to earn rest, that he had to be useful to be loved, that he had to carry it all alone. He set those stories down like old coats that no longer fit and stepped forward into the cool air, lighter than he had been in years. He still stumbled, still doubted, still fell back into old habits from time to time, but he no longer shamed himself for it. He simply noticed, adjusted, forgave, continued, because that was the work, to live, not flawlessly, but fully, to keep choosing truth even when it trembled, to keep showing up even when it hurt, to keep loving even when the world forgot how. And in doing so, he found what he had been searching for all along, not a version of himself that others approved of, but the one that felt like home. There was a moment one evening, as the sky turned to ash and fire, when he realized how much of his life had been lived in anticipation of something else, a better day, a better version of himself, a time when the chaos would quiet, when the fear would dissolve, when he would finally be ready. But the sun didn't wait for permission to set. and the stars didn't ask if it was a good night to appear. They simply showed up. And in their rhythm, he felt a kind of truth that settled deep into his bones. He had spent so long waiting to feel prepared, to feel certain, to feel worthy. But what if those things came not before the journey, but during it? What if readiness was a myth, and the real transformation happened when you stepped forward anyway, trembling but honest? He watched the dusk deepen around him, and something softened. He wasn't behind. He wasn't late. He was arriving finally to his own life, not the one he thought he was supposed to live, but the one that had been waiting for him to notice its quiet beauty. He had built his life on resilience, on getting through, on pushing past discomfort. But now he was learning that strength could look like softness, that courage could mean slowing down, that healing might not be about rising above the pain, but about meeting it face to face and choosing to love himself through it. He found himself talking less in conversations, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was finally listening. Really listening, not to respond, not to fix, but to witness. People opened up in ways he hadn't expected, because there was something powerful in simply being present. No judgment, no agenda, just presence. He had underestimated that presence for most of his life. He thought solutions mattered more, results, progress. But what he discovered in those quiet moments with others was that what people needed most wasn't advice. It was someone who could sit beside their pain without flinching. Someone who could hold their story without rushing to rewrite it. He had become that person, slowly, naturally, as his own capacity for self-compassion deepened. The more he learned to be gentle with himself, the more he could be gentle with the world. His edges had softened, not from weakness, but from wisdom. He no longer saw life as something to conquer. He saw it as something to cradle, to move through with reverence. He began to forgive, not just others, but himself, for the moments he snapped, for the love he didn't know how to receive, for the times he said yes when everything inside him screamed no. He forgave the version of himself who didn't know how to rest, who thought love had to be earned, who confused productivity with value. That version of him wasn't wrong. He was just surviving the only way he knew how. And now that he had more tools, more tenderness, more truth, he could begin again. He started reclaiming rituals that had been buried under the weight of busyness, long showers that felt like baptisms, cooking meals with his hands instead of rushing through takeout menus, reading books slowly, letting each sentence wash over him. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines, anchors back to himself. He noticed the way the light moved through his home at different times of day, the way certain songs made him feel things he hadn't touched in years, the way his breath grew deeper when he unclenched his jaw and let his shoulders drop. His body had been holding stories he hadn't yet read, and now he was learning to listen to its language. He no longer ignored the signals, the tightness in his chest when he was out of alignment, the weariness that settled in when he betrayed his boundaries, the quiet unease that followed people who didn't honor his energy. He stopped calling these things dramatic. They were data, truth speaking through sensation. And when he listened, life responded. He no longer needed his life to look a certain way. He just needed it to feel like truth. Some days that meant solitude. Others it meant showing up fully for someone else. Some moments asked for action, others for surrender. He had stopped categorizing days as good or bad. Each one simply offered something, a lesson, a mirror, a moment of grace. He became more discerning with his time, not because he was busy, but because he was sacred. Every hour held energy. Every yes was a contract. And he wanted his yeses to be rooted in authenticity, not obligation. He no longer said yes to avoid guilt. He said yes when his spirit whispered, "This aligns." And he trusted that whisper more than he trusted the noise. He learned to let go without bitterness. Letting go of what no longer fit didn't mean those things had no value. It meant their season had passed. He honored them as he released them. Old beliefs, old roles, old relationships. He didn't rush the process. He allowed grief. And then he allowed space for newness to enter. There were days he missed the old rhythm, the thrill of chasing, the comfort of familiar dysfunction. But then he remembered how tired he had been, how his body had ached under the weight of pretending, how his soul had dulled under the constant pressure to perform. This new way was unfamiliar, but it was honest. It asked more of his heart and less of his mask. It required trust, not control. He wasn't trying to be impressive anymore. He was trying to be real, and real, he had found, was enough. At night, he lit a candle before bed, not out of ritual, but out of reverence. As the flame danced, he reflected on his day, not with judgment, but with presence. What had moved him? What had challenged him? What had softened him? And in that reflection, he found peace, not because everything had gone right, but because he had shown up with truth. He fell asleep, not with a to-do list in his mind, but with a prayer in his chest, a quiet promise to keep choosing himself, to keep honoring what was real, to keep walking this path of becoming, not towards someone new, but towards someone more whole. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't need them. He had something better. He had himself, fully, finally. And that was enough to carry him forward. The morning was cold, but clear. The kind of morning that doesn't demand anything from you, but simply welcomes you as you are. He wrapped himself in a blanket and stepped outside barefoot, feeling the dew-soaked grass beneath his feet. It was a small act of rebellion against the pace he used to live by, a life where even getting dressed felt like a race. But this moment wasn't about urgency. It was about belonging, belonging to the world, to the wind, to his breath. He stood still, the air crisp in his lungs, and felt something ancient begin to settle inside him. The world had not slowed down for him. Cars still rushed by in the distance. Notifications still pulsed from unseen screens. But he had changed. He no longer moved to the rhythm of demands. He moved to the rhythm of his own spirit. And that rhythm, he had come to learn, was quieter, slower, deeper. He had stopped reaching for things that looked good but felt empty. The clothes that fit a role he no longer played. The conversations that kept him in shallow waters. The activities that drained his energy more than they gave him life. He realized that just because something had worked once didn't mean it was meant to stay. Growth asked him to loosen his grip, to allow space for shedding. There was grief in the letting go. Even when he knew it was right, even when the release was a form of liberation. Because these things, these people, places, and patterns had once held him. Even if imperfectly, they had given him something. And saying goodbye, even to what no longer aligned, meant closing a chapter of who he used to be. He didn't rush the grief. He gave it its due, sat with it in silence, lit candles to it in his heart, let tears carve out room for something new. And slowly in that space of mourning, he found something unexpected, gratitude, not just for what had been good, but for what had been hard, for the moments that broke him open, for the discomfort that forced him to ask deeper questions, for the loneliness that taught him how to sit with himself. He began to see that nothing had been wasted. Every moment had been part of the unfolding. Even the missteps, especially the missteps. He started writing letters he never sent, to people he had loved, to people who had hurt him, to versions of himself he no longer recognized. He wrote to the boy who had felt invisible, to the young man who confused performance with value, to the adult who had spent too many years ignoring his own needs. He didn't judge these versions. He honored them, thanked them, told them, "You did your best, and I'm proud of you." It was in those quiet letters that he realized something profound. He had been seeking closure from others, when what he really needed was closure with himself. He didn't need an apology to heal. He didn't need validation to move forward. He just needed to witness his own truth, to speak it out loud, to let it echo back to him with kindness. He returned to music, not the kind that filled the room, but the kind that filled his chest. He played old records, let the melodies wrap around him like a memory he didn't know he'd been missing. Some songs made him weep without warning. Others made him smile with a softness that lingered all day. Music became a mirror, a prayer, a friend. It spoke to places in him that words never reached. And when the music stopped, he sat in the quiet. Not as a punishment, but as a practice. To hear what lived beneath the noise, the stories still waiting to be told, the dreams still waiting to be believed in, the fears still waiting to be met with love. He learned that stillness wasn't the absence of movement, it was the fullness of presence. He no longer filled his schedule to feel worthy. In fact, he often cleared it, made time for nothing, and found that nothing was not empty. It was sacred. It was in those unstructured hours that he had the most honest conversations with himself. He didn't fill the silence. He let it expand. And in that expansion, he discovered freedom. He changed his relationship with time. It was no longer a resource to be managed, but a companion to be respected. He stopped saying, "I don't have time," and started saying, "It's not my priority." That small shift changed everything. It made him accountable to his choices. It made him intentional with his energy. It made him aware of what truly mattered. He prioritized rest, not just sleep, but restoration. Moments where his nervous system could breathe, where his body could unravel its tension, where his mind could drift without obligation. He stopped glorifying exhaustion, stopped treating burnout like a badge of honor. He had seen what that path led to, and he wasn't willing to trade his well-being for approval ever again. He nourished himself, not just with food, but with tenderness. He stopped punishing his body for not fitting an image, stopped ignoring its needs. He listened when it said it was full, when it said it was tired, when it said, "Please stretch," or "Please be gentle." His body, once treated like a machine, was now honored like a sacred vessel, a home, a temple of truth. And as his relationship with his body healed, so did his relationship with intimacy. He no longer sought to be desired. He sought to be known, to be touched, yes, but also to be seen, to be held not for what he gave, but for who he was. He no longer performed love. He embodied it, slowly, softly, sincerely. Some days he was still afraid of falling back into old patterns, afraid of being too much or not enough, afraid of opening his heart and being hurt again. But now he knew how to hold that fear, to sit with it like a child crying in the dark, to whisper, "It's okay, I've got you." Because he did. He had himself now in a way he never had before, and that changed everything. He began to see beauty again, not the curated kind on screens, but the kind that lives in imperfections, in chipped mugs and crooked smiles, in the laugh that turns into a snort, in the way the sky looks just before a storm. Beauty that wasn't trying to be anything, just being. And maybe that's what he was learning to do too. To be, not perfectly, but honestly. To meet each moment with his whole self, his light and shadow, his strength and softness, his fear and his faith. He no longer needed to be remarkable. He just needed to be real. And that was more than enough. The sky that day was overcast, a smooth blanket of gray that softened the light, as if the world itself was inviting gentleness. He sat by his window, watching people pass on the street, each face carrying its own invisible storm or sunshine. And as he observed them, he realized just how much we never know about each other, how much we assume, how often we rush past someone unaware that they might be holding grief in their lungs, regret in their chest, or an unspoken hope in the corners of their eyes. And yet we judge so quickly. A glance, a tone, a moment of withdrawal, and we decide who someone is. But he'd begun to look deeper, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, out of reverence for the hidden battles people carry. He noticed how a child clutched her father's hand not because she was afraid, but because she was sure of love. He watched an older man sit alone on a bench, his hands trembling slightly as he fed birds, and felt something in his chest ache, not from sadness, but from recognition. We are all in our own ways trying to feel safe, to feel held, to feel like we matter. He had started offering smiles more often, not performative ones, but the kind that say, "I see you." He didn't always get a smile in return, but that didn't matter. The giving itself was enough, a small act of kindness without expectation, a reminder that connection didn't always need conversation. Sometimes just being present was enough to shift something unseen. He had learned to honor the quiet things, the moments that once slipped through the cracks of attention, the softness of a blanket pulled around his shoulders, the warmth of a cup held with both hands, the way a tree swayed slightly even when there was no wind. Just its own need to move. These things didn't announce themselves. They didn't ask to be seen. But when noticed, they became portals to something deeper, something steady, something true. And truth, he had come to understand, wasn't always easy to hold. Sometimes it burned. Sometimes it revealed what he had worked so hard to hide. But it also freed him, set him down gently in a place where he could finally breathe fully. Truth didn't require perfection. It just asked for presence, for honesty, for the courage to say, "This is who I am," even when that felt risky. There were still days he longed for certainty, for the comfort of knowing what came next. But he had also learned that uncertainty wasn't a punishment. It was a passage, a space where possibility lived, a reminder that life wasn't a straight path, but a spiraling dance. Sometimes we return to the same lesson, not because we've failed, but because there's a deeper layer to explore. He stopped trying to rush through pain, to skip to the lesson, to find the silver lining before the storm had passed. Now he let pain stay as long as it needed to, gave it tea in a chair, listened to what it came to teach, and only when it was ready, let it go. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Pain had softened him, made him more open, more attuned to joy. And joy, when it came, was no longer something he chased. It was something he allowed, something that arrived quietly and without warning, like laughter in the middle of a deep conversation, like sunlight breaking through the clouds after days of rain, like waking up and realizing that, for no particular reason, you feel okay. Joy didn't need a reason anymore. It just needed space. He started creating space intentionally, in his home, in his mind, in his heart. He let go of clutter, not just physical but emotional. Old grudges, outdated beliefs, the inner critic that sounded too much like voices from the past. He thanked those voices for trying to keep him safe, then gently asked them to step aside. There was a new voice now, softer but stronger, a voice rooted in compassion. He spoke to himself like someone he loved, and that, more than anything, changed the way he moved through the world. When he stumbled, he didn't scold. He steadied. When he fell short, he didn't spiral. He breathed. When he needed rest, he took it without shame. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to stay true to the quiet pulse within him, the one that had been silenced for too long, but never stopped beating. He became a safe place for others, not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned how to be with his own questions. People sensed it. They leaned in, spoke more freely, cried without apology, laughed without reservation. With him, they didn't need to perform either. He wasn't interested in masks. He wanted real. And in being real, he gave others permission to be the same. He no longer sought love that came with conditions. He had tasted love that only showed up when he was agreeable, when he was successful, when he stayed within the lines. That kind of love was exhausting. It asked him to shrink, to edit himself, to prove his worth again and again. But now he sought a different kind of love, the kind that said, even when you're messy, I'm not leaving. The kind that stayed through the unraveling, through the rebuilding, the kind that knew love wasn't a transaction, it was a presence. And perhaps the most profound love he had found was the one he now held for himself. Not egoic, not boastful, just quiet, steady, enduring. A love that didn't require mirrors or praise. A love that said, you're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to be human. And in this love, he became softer, not just with himself, but with the world. He no longer expected everyone to understand him. He no longer demanded that they get it. He just kept living in a way that felt true. He offered his light not to convince, but to illuminate. If it helped someone else see, beautiful. If not, he kept shining anyway. He understood now that peace didn't mean everything was resolved. It meant he was no longer resisting what was. It meant meeting life as it came, with open hands, with an open heart, and trusting that whatever came, he could meet it, because he had, again and again. He had met loss, met change, met grief, met fear, and through it all, he had kept showing up. Not because he had to, because something inside him refused to go numb again, refused to sleepwalk through another season, refused to abandon the sacredness of now. And so, he kept choosing presence, kept choosing honesty, kept choosing love. Not the perfect kind, but the real kind. And in that choice, he wasn't just healing himself. He was becoming a lighthouse for others, not by trying, just by being, fully, authentically, unapologetically.